Welcome everyone to the inaugural event of the 2019 Notre Dame Forum, where we will try to take an honest and informed look at the clergy's sexual abuse scandal and responses to it as we attempt to discern how we might best respond. Our reflections will be informed, of course, by the facts, but also by faith in God who brings life out of death, who shines light in darkness. In this effort, we invoke Christ's summons to St. Francis of Assisi, rebuild my church. Our moderator tonight has achieved a minor miracle. He has made the Catholic Church in general, and the Vatican in particular, understandable to millions of readers around the world. The author of several books, including 2 on Pope Benedict alone, the holder of multiple honorary degrees, John Allen is a former columnist for the National Catholic Reporter, a former editor at the Boston Globe, and founding editor of Crux Now, which is essential reading for Catholics and everyone else who is interested in the faith, culture, and politics of the Church. Newsweek's former religion editor, Ken Woodward, once observed that, quote, outside of the North Korean government, no bureaucracy is harder for a journalist to crack than the Vatican's. And no one does it better than John Allen. In writing his own generous column about this Notre Dame Forum, John Allen said, quote, Notre Dame is basically the Texas of the American Catholic Church, meaning it tends to operate on the principle, go big or go home. When Notre Dame searched for the best moderator of this esteemed panel, we went big. Please welcome John Allen.
I would start by telling you that everything that Father John just told you is a bald-faced lie, but by the end of this evening, you'll figure that out for yourself, so no need for me to go into it. Father John, I do want to say on behalf of all of us, and I don't just mean those of us on the panel, but everyone in this room, thank you for putting this evening together. I have been covering the clerical abuse scandals in the Catholic Church my entire professional career. And as a result, I have come to know either directly or indirectly all of the 4 guests we have with us here tonight. I can promise you any one of them easily by her or himself could have sustained a fascinating conversation. To bring all 4 of them together at the same time is utterly remarkable. And so thank you, Father Jenkins. Thank you, Notre Dame, for making this happen. It is my honor to present our speakers here tonight. This may well be the first time this has ever been said in a public space, but on our far right, we have Peter Steinfels. Peter, quite literally needs no introduction. As a journalist, I can tell you that Peter certainly in my line of work would be seen as the dean of religion reporters and religion journalists in the United States. Peter, for 10 years, was a religion reporter for the New York Times, 20 years a columnist for the New York Times. He's also served as the editor of Commonweal, extraordinarily distinguished Catholic journal. And he has deep Notre Dame ties, ladies and gentlemen. He is a former visiting professor here at Notre Dame. And he is also a co-recipient, along with his wife Peggy, of the university's Latari Medal, basically the Medal of Honor for the American Catholic Church. So Peter, welcome, and you honor us by being here tonight. Next, we have Juan Carlos Cruz. Juan Carlos is a very successful senior executive of a major multinational corporation, Livent. Sorry. We live in an era of elision. I'm never on top of that. He is from Chile. He is also himself a survivor of clerical sexual abuse. He is a survivor of abuse by a now former priest named Fernando Caradima, who, to put this in American terms, was basically the John Gagin of Chile, that country's most notorious pedophile priest. Juan Carlos will not say this himself because he is far too modest, but in the survivors community, he is considered a hero. He is not quite personally responsible, but certainly carries a great deal of responsibility for shining a spotlight on the scandals in Chile and making the entire world sit up and take notice. Juan Carlos also, to his credit, has something that very few people can claim, which is he helped convert a pope. At the beginning of the abuse scandals in Chile, Pope Francis was slow, I think it is fair to say, to recognize the urgency and the depth of the crisis in that country, and it was in part through conversations with Juan Carlos, hearing his story, coming to believe in his integrity, that Pope Francis basically did a 180-degree turn on the situation in Chile. He is an extraordinarily important voice in this conversation. Juan Carlos, thank you for being with us. Next, we have Kathleen McChesney. In my business, the media business, we overuse the word expert terribly, but Kathleen is the real deal. She has a deep background in law enforcement. At one point in her career, she was the third highest official in the power structure at the FBI. She then agreed to become the director of the U.S. Bishop's Office of Child Protection after the adoption of the 2002 Dallas Charter, where she helped pioneer a mechanism for ensuring accountability and compliance with that charter in dioceses all up and down the country. In 2012, she published, along with Thomas Plant, published a book entitled The Sexual Abuse Scandals in the Catholic Church, A Decade of Crisis, and is working on volume 2, I believe. Isn't that right?
Hope to.
Yeah. Or at least thinking about volume 2. And she continues to do extensive consulting in terms of child protection and compliance with the ideals and the practices inspired by the Dallas Charter. She is one of the quiet heroes of the campaign for reform and renewal in the Catholic Church. Kathleen, you honor us by being here. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
And in another unexpected irony of the evening, on my far left, we have with us Archbishop William Lori of Baltimore. Archbishop Lori has been dealing with this issue in the first person for an awfully long time. Actually, we were talking over dinner how your first real experience in leadership of engaging this issue dates all the way back to 1994. Archbishop Lori was named an auxiliary bishop in Washington in 1995. He was later named the Bishop of Bridgeport, Connecticut, and in 2012 he was named the Archbishop of Baltimore, which you could make a case is basically the primatial see of the American Catholic Church. He has also been in leadership on the national level on this issue for a long time. He was part of the drafting committee for the Dallas Charter in 2002 and the essential norms that accompanied that charter. He was also part of a team that had to go over to Rome after the bishops adopted those documents because to engage in classic Vatican euphemism, this was not without its difficulties. And Archbishop Lori was part of the effort to make sure that the charter and the norms stuck. And then in various capacities in his episcopal career has been put in positions where he has had to himself try to make the principles of those documents stick. You have been in the trenches on this issue for a long time. And for those efforts and also for your graciousness in being here tonight, Archbishop Lori, thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
So just a couple of logistical notes. Each of our speakers will begin with an opening reflection of about 5 minutes because we want this to be a conversation, not a series of monologues. After that, well, we will see. I may ask a follow-up myself, but we will also have live questions here from the audience. And then we are also going to be taking questions in cyber format. You will see behind me the way to direct those questions. I also want to welcome everyone who is watching this event who is not here in the Performing Arts Center, but who is following us on the live stream either on the Notre Dame website or on the Crux website, cruxnow.com, your one-stop shopping destination for the best in smart, wired, and independent Catholic journalism. And those questions will be collected, and at an appropriate moment, you will see me whipping out an iPad that is presently under my chair. This is not me checking the Yankees score, although I may do that too, but this is me collecting the questions and then presenting them to our speakers. Okay? So with that, Peter, would you get us started? The event is called The Church Crisis, Where Are We Now? So Peter, where are we?
Thank you very much, John, and thank you, Notre Dame. Like John, I have followed and written about the sex abuse story for about 3 decades. And the one thing that I am most certain about is that most of us, myself very much included, know much less about this painful, stomach-churning scandal than we think we know. Probably you know what the John Jay College of Criminal Justice researchers found, that during the half century between 1950 to 2002, between 4 and 5% of the American Catholic clergy sexually abused well over 10,000 young people. You might well know that a huge percentage of this abuse occurred between 60 to 35 years ago. You know probably, I'm pretty sure, that in 2002, the bishops passed a charter for the protection of children and young people, and that it mandated what was called zero tolerance. Anyone credibly accused of abusing a minor at any time in the past must be removed from all priestly ministry and identification. Fewer people know how precipitous the drop in incidents of clergy sex abuse was in the late 1980s and 1990s. My fellow panelist, Kathleen McChesney, has been quoted as saying that the number of reported abuse cases has dropped from about 600 annually between 1965 and 1985 to about 20 since 2004, and in some years, by my own count, between 4 and 12. Statistics like this can be very dangerous. They can blind us to the excruciating, life-derailing devastation caused by a single case of abuse. It is the most intimate kind of violation, whether perpetrated by a school teacher, coach, physician, or above all, a person in a special relationship of trust, like a parent or cleric. As Kathleen immediately pointed out, one case is one too many. But the statistics cannot be ignored either. Suppose that the current horrid rates of deaths by gun violence or by opioid overdose declined, like Catholic clergy sex abuse cases, by almost 97%. Would we pretend that nothing significant had happened? Anyone who obscures this dramatic drop in Catholic clergy abuse, as I think the Pennsylvania grand jury report did, is simply not telling the truth. The abuse scandal will always remain one in a long list of betrayals of Jesus Christ. The church burned heretics. The church long approved of slavery. The church planted the anti-Judaism that finally mutated into genocidal anti-Semitism. No Catholic beneficiary of a Notre Dame education can escape those terrible facts. We are called to ponder and pray and ask why those betrayals occurred and what will prevent them from ever reoccurring. But if the danger to children and young people in American Catholic institutions has been drastically reduced, as I believe the evidence shows, why are we talking not just about a lasting scandal, but about a pressing crisis? I suggest 5 reasons. 1, the abuse scandal has gone global. Every year, more than 120 million children are sexually abused worldwide. It is woeful that even a small fraction of that exploitation has touched the church. But today, what happens or happened in Chile or Australia or Italy or Poland or Nigeria constitutes one big story about Catholicism. 2, in the U.S., the McCarrick case has brought to a boil a long-simmering distrust of the American hierarchy by both liberal and conservative camps of active Catholics, each camp with its own agenda for reform. 3, the scandal has consequently become part of a kind of Catholic civil war over the papacy of Pope Francis, symbolized by the demand a year ago for his resignation by Archbishop Vigano. 4, in the U.S., a growing parade of state and federal investigations promises to produce a drip, drip, drip of sensational headlines, draining morale and resources and magnifying the ongoing hemorrhaging of the young from the faith. 5, there is a legacy of profound suffering, pain, and desire for acknowledgement, contrition, justice, and vindication on the part of victim survivors of priestly abuse, stemming primarily, but not entirely, from 30 to 60 years ago. These are like landmines left buried in the ground after a war. A little over a year ago, the Pennsylvania grand jury report sent shockwaves through the Catholic world from the Vatican to this campus. The report claimed, 1, that since 1945, 300 priests in 6 dioceses had abused young people, and 2, that all church officials had done nothing but brush aside the victims and hide the abuse. The second claim, I quickly realized, demanded fact-checking. Drilling down into the report's 884 pages, far beyond the incendiary 12-page introduction that was the basis of virtually every news story, I found that in from 65 to 80% of the cases, depending on the diocese, the material in the report itself did not support its sweeping and damning charges against church officials. To cite a shop-worn joke, an error rate of 65 to 80% is not even, quote, good enough for government work. Aware that my conclusion challenged a widespread impression, I spent 12,000 words spelling my conclusions out for publication in the January 25th issue of Commonweal and online at commonwealmagazine.org. More importantly, the shock and misinformation created by the Pennsylvania report brought home to me the need for a real history of the sex abuse scandal. The dominant narrative has been overwhelmingly shaped by lawsuits to obtain some recompense or survivor victims from dioceses and from their insurance companies. We should not begrudge plaintiffs' lawyers for carrying out their responsibilities to their clients, but they are not historians. No historian would accept the 1792 trial of Louis XVI as a history of the French Revolution. No historian would accept the Nuremberg trials, valuable as they were, as an adequate explanation of why Germany produced the genocidal Nazi Reich. Too many profoundly important factors are left out. A trial is not a history. A genuine history will require the creation of archives, oral history interviews, and study of the scandal's religious, cultural, and economic contexts. So I will close my remarks with a plea that Catholic institutions of higher education like this one take up this essential task. It has been said that we walk backwards into the future looking at our past. A genuine history is needed for our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Juan Carlos, Peter just told us the scandals have gone global. That certainly has been your experience, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. I'll let the experts talk about statistics, talk about what they know so well. I'm going to speak from the heart. And first, I want to start by saying thank you to Father Jenkins. I happen to have been educated in Chile at the Holy Cross School by the Holy Cross priests. And then I spent a year and a half here at Notre Dame at Moreau Seminary. And I can tell you, those were the most wonderful years of my life. I experienced healing. I had not spoken about what had happened to me by this parish priest. And I found solace walking around the grotto, walking where you walk every day. And today when I landed, I left my bags and went and walked, and I choked up because I owe so much to Notre Dame and to the Holy Cross priests. And I have remained Catholic because I decided very early on that I wasn't going to let them win. I wasn't going to let the bad ones win, because I believe that the relationship anybody, man, woman, any age, has with God, being God, Yahweh, Allah, whatever, it's the most basic human right that one can have, is to believe in what you believe, and nobody can mess with it. And so I wasn't going to let them mess with that, because if I am here today, it's because my faith has sustained me. Every survivor is a world in its own. And you have to understand that there are people that are very angry. I have friends that have committed suicide, many, too many. And amongst you here, there might be a survivor. And I want you to know that it's really hard to speak out and to tell your story. But I also want you to know that there's so many people that are waiting to lend you a hand to help you through that horrible pain. So thank you, Father Jenkins. Thank you, Notre Dame. Thank you, John. Thanks for inviting me. I'm no hero. I'm just a person that when they ask me, what gives you courage? Well, what gives me courage is so many brave people that I hear speaking out, so many people that I see that want to help survivors, and all those friends that I've lost, and all that silent majority that's walking around there without being able to speak their horrible misery that eats you up inside. I thought so many times about committing suicide, and I'm so glad I didn't, because my life has turned into a life of trying to heal, but trying to help other survivors experience maybe what I've experienced. I'm lucky to have these platforms where people invite me to speak on TV, here, at major events, and there are survivors in the audience, or there are other survivors listening, and they have the courage to speak. I've had in Chile a man, 85-year-old man, who was abused by a priest when he was a little boy. And he told me, and he said, ever since I heard you, I was able to tell my story, and now I don't have that eating me up inside, and I can die a happy person. And, you know, it doesn't matter what age you are. It doesn't matter if you're a man, a woman, whatever you are. Know that if you have been abused, if you have gone through that trauma, there's people that are going to be there to help you. I also want to say that there is so much to be done. We talk about statistics. Okay, it's gone down in the United States. It hasn't gone down in the world. It's getting worse. And bishops, and you know, when I was starting my conversation, or before I even met Pope Francis, I thought, gosh, if I was only able to talk to Pope Francis, he speaks Spanish, he's from a neighboring country of mine. I mean, he has to understand. And being the Pope, a stroke of a pen, he passes a law and this will end. That's what I thought. I went to the Vatican, I saw what happens, and trust me, no pen, no nothing can switch or change the attitude of some bishops, because they go to, Pope Francis wants to solve the problem. I've talked to him, and I know that he's sincere. However, the bishops go, talk to him, say, absolutely, Pope Francis. They nod their heads, they bow, they kiss his ring. They go back to the countries and do the same thing they've been doing. Cover up, cover up, cover up. Nobody holds them accountable, and that needs to stop. And the other thing is what I've seen lately here, and you mentioned it, Peter, Bishop Vigano and several bishops in the United States and cardinals, Burke, Chaput, several, weaponizing victims, weaponizing survivors. Why? Because they want to pass their ultra-conservative agenda. And the way of hurting Francis is by hurting him with the abuse crisis. But that's not what they care about. They'll drop victims as soon as they pass their agenda. And their agenda is going back to this elitism, this power that they can't let go. So we have to fight against that. We have to know that we have to hold these people accountable. So what gives me courage is you. It's all the survivors out there. It's all the people that don't dare to speak, that suffer in silence, that we can all help. And, and knowing that there are good people out there that will lend a hand if you need it. And so that's what gives me courage.
Juan Carlos, you said that you consider yourself lucky when you get invited to speak at events like this. I want you to hear that the people who are actually lucky are all the rest of us every time you say yes.
Thanks.
Thank you. Tough acts to follow, Kathleen. But what is your take on where we're at, in the unfinished business?
Well, first of all, it is an honor to be here with all of you and to follow you. Your story resonates, I'm sure, with many people in the audience on a number of different levels. But if anyone has asked themselves, well, why am I going tonight? What is it that I expect to hear? I think you've heard what you came here to hear, and that was people who have courage. So I hope that those of you who are out there who haven't found somebody to talk to do know that there are people who will help you. Things have changed, as Peter indicated, over time. I want to take my time with you this evening to tell you some of the observations I have made in the nearly 2 decades of working on this issue on and off. Just to be clear, I don't work for the Bishops' Conference any longer, but I gained a great deal of experience in that role and in the work I do with dioceses and religious communities around the world. I want to give you a backdrop with regard to my work and the observations I'm going to make tonight, the disappointments I'm going to tell you about that I've experienced and others have experienced, and then I want to make some predictions about what I think will be happening in the near term and the long term. When I first went to work for the Bishops' Conference and the Dallas Charter was new and we were very excited about implementing some of the wonderful aspects of the Charter, I talked with many survivors like you, like maybe some of you in the audience. And I remember specifically one man said to me, look, you can have all the programs in the world that you want. You can have policies, you can have training, you can have background investigations, you can do all of those things. He said, but until the bishops realize that there has to be true accountability, I and my fellow survivors are not going to heal. So I say that as to bring together the first point that I want to make, and that's about accountability. It is so critical for the men and women who've been abused to know that someone is responsible, someone's taking responsibility for what has happened to them. The other side of that coin is if there's responsibility, there should be credit. And the credit goes to the men and the women, the volunteers, the clergy, all the people who've come together in the last 2 decades to try and get those numbers down to much lower levels of abuse, not only in our church, but it has had an impact in other youth-serving organizations as well. Second observation I want to make is that abuse occurs not only by clergy, but by other people in Catholic ministries. It occurs, it's people who are abusers are consecrated laypersons. They are teachers, they are volunteers, they are music ministers. There are people within the entire spectrum of Catholic ministries who do abuse, and we can't take our eye off the ball in that regard. We have to look at the church writ large. There has been good, sufficient support for men and women who've been abused, much more professional, much more pastoral than in years past, but it's still not enough. There's still some confusion about how to deal with the 72-year-old man who is telling his story for the first time. Should there be outreach? Will we be re-victimizing that man or that woman if we go and talk to them and offer them care? It's something that you have to work on case by case, person by person. You can't lump everyone together in terms of the pastoral support that they need. Some people want to be reconnected to the church. Some people want nothing to do with the church. I've observed a serious lack of oversight of clerics in particular over time, and I think one of the key reasons for that is that we expect one bishop who may have hundreds of priests to be in touch with them every day and knowing what they're doing. For some priests, some pastors, their life is very singular and very, very lonesome, and they don't see and interact with people who can guide them, who can mentor them, who can observe their behavior. So it's left to the laity to become knowledgeable and know what sorts of behavior they should be looking at that could be putting people at risk. On the other side of that coin, too, is I don't see enough support for clergy in terms of their health and wellness. In some dioceses that I work with, there's not even a person who's a vicar for clergy or a priest for priests. You need people who can help these men who sometimes don't understand what it means to have appropriate adult relationships and how to have healthy social lives. There has been the cart before the horse, on my next point, in terms of formation. Over the last 17, 18 years, there's been a lot of emphasis on restructuring seminaries, in adding the human formation element and emphasizing it much more. In my experience, I think that selection is more important than formation. You can have the best formation programs, the best seminaries in the entire world, but if you have selected the wrong person to go into the seminary, someone who is so troubled, doesn't know what they want to do, has mental health issues, that person is never going to become a healthy cleric. So to have a healthy presbyterate, you need to start with healthy men. And then the laity, their contributions have been overlooked in terms of value. The laity have been involved in reducing the number of incidents of abuse for 20, 30, 40 years. But they've acted on sort of a lower level. They're not out front, but they're the ones who are teaching. They're the ones who are doing background investigations. They are the ones who are pressuring bishops to do more, to meet with men and women who've been abused. It's not an easy thing to sit across from someone who is crying, who is hurting, who is in pain, and to accept that. But they do, and the laity has been a large part of encouraging bishops to be pastoral, to be the shepherds that they should be. I want to just list for you some things that I have been disappointed about. One of the things was that strikes me personally from having a law enforcement background is that in 2002, after Spotlight and the crisis and the Dallas Charter, there was really a substantial lack of law enforcement interest in this issue. Now we have 16 attorneys, state attorneys generals looking at these cases, and a lot more emphasis on the abuse that occurred. One of the issues, of course, is the statute of limitations has passed on many of these cases. But I always wondered, where is the law enforcement response 2 decades ago? And it wasn't there. Similarly, there were many recommendations made by the National Review Board, by our office, by lay groups about ways that the church could move forward. There were a lot of recommendations by men and women who were survivors, and they haven't been listened to. Now some of those recommendations are being brought up again as if they're brand new. They've been there, they just haven't been acted on. There's been a lack of research into the causes of the cases that have occurred since the charter. One would think that since the abuse crisis in 2002 was on the front page of a newspaper in this country for 365 days in a row, that everyone would understand. But there have been cases, not as many, certainly as in the 60s and 70s, but there have been cases. Why did those happen? Who missed that lesson, and why? And where was the oversight of those persons who abused? The failure of the church to embrace technology and use the data that the church now has, I think, is another disappointment. I hope that the church can put together the information it does have. There are people out there indicating that they are ministering in the name of the church, and nobody really knows who they are. There's not a good Catholic directory. There are not good disclosure lists. Those things are easily done and need to be done in the interests of transparency and accountability. I see a lack of vision in terms of ways to do new vocations and structuring of formation and seminaries, I'd like to really see some sea changes in that regard. And of course, my last disappointment is in the area of issue fatigue and complacency. We can't let our tiredness, our sadness overtake us, overtake our passion for continuing to work on these issues. The last thing I'm going to say, I have 5 predictions that I'll make about things that I think we'll see in the near future. I think that there will continue to be cases against church authorities, bishops probably in particular, for those who are living that were thought to be negligent in terms of how they handle these cases. I think there will be additional scandals, whether they're financial or sexual, whether they're in our schools, other ministries, or whether they're in our seminaries. I think there will be a harder line with the Pope's recent motu proprio, a harder line on those bishops and church authorities who were negligent in responding to incidents of abuse. I think, and I agree with what was said before, there will be a continued use of this issue to promote a personal agenda, a conservative agenda, a liberal agenda, whatever it is. A shameful use of what has happened to these men and women. I think that we're going to see civil, canon, and criminal law changes over time. I think you're going to see a greater emphasis on vulnerable adults, on identifying who those people are. And I think, as my last prediction, that the church will continue to be slow to reform. I think that shouldn't be an option, but I think that sadly that is the way that the church works. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. I personally love predictions, among other things, because we're obviously going to have you back, a year or so from now to find out how close to the money you were on all of those points. You mentioned the lay role in all this and the fundamental role that laity have in this conversation. I mean, you don't need me to tell you that you are a shining example of that. You have been a courageous lay woman helping lead this fight in the church for a long time now, so thank you. All right, Archbishop. Well, going last in a situation like this is a little bit like a poker game. You have the advantage. Everyone else has already shown their cards. But if you're only holding a pair of 2s, it really doesn't make much difference. So now we get, but I'm confident knowing you that what you've got is more akin to a straight flush or something of that magnitude. So, Archbishop, the floor is yours. The church crisis, where are we?
Well, thank you very much, John. Good evening, everybody. Before I came out, I was asked by the Observer how I felt about being the only bishop on this panel. And my answer was, no pressure there. Yeah, I've been a bishop nearly 25 years. And in that ministry, there have been a lot of learning curves. But I don't think any of the learning curves have been as steep as discovering, learning, struggling to deal in some adequate way with the ugly specter of child abuse. When I became a bishop a long time ago, there were some policies in place, maybe going back as far as the 80s in most dioceses. As has been indicated already tonight, in 2002, with the development of the Charter for the Protection of Children and Young People and the norms, that was a line in the sand. There was an attempt to say that all dioceses, all bishops would accept, adopt a set of policies and procedures in order to deal more adequately, thoroughly, God willing, compassionately, with this issue and to try to prevent it. But as also been said tonight, it's one thing to have policies and procedures in place. It's another thing to live them. It's another thing to draw out from them the values, the moral values, the moral imperative to address this in the way that God only knows it deserves to be addressed. Yes, the numbers have gone down, but one case is still too many, and the need remains and will always remain not to see the charter, the norms, or vos estis, or any of the other things that are put in place whereby bishops are held accountable simply as policies to be complied with. In the grace of the Holy Spirit, there's really got to be, on the part of people like me, the part of my co-workers, the part of my lay co-workers, a conversion of mind and heart. It's got to be as much a part of the life of the church to protect children and to reach out to victim survivors. That's as much as a part of the church's life as evangelization is, as Catholic education is, as raising up vocations is. One of the big learning curves for me as a bishop, and I can speak for myself, maybe I can reflect conversations I have with other bishops, but I can't speak for every bishop. One of the big things I can say is learning how to listen to victims. I've been meeting with victims a long time, going back to 1994-95. And of course, I was told almost from the get-go, you shouldn't talk, you should listen. But learning how to listen, learning how to put the victim in the victim survivor in the driver's seat, learning that I, as the bishop listening to this, cannot fully appreciate the nature of the experience that's being described to me. Not trying to be the person that has the answer, not trying to be the person who pushes in the conversation or who offers something that might not be wanted by the victim survivor at that moment. In other words, the victim survivor has to be in the driver's seat. It's not just a question of meeting them. It's not just a question of affirming. It's a question of listening deeply, and believing them. A couple of weeks ago in the Archdiocese of Baltimore, we were privileged to have Marie Collins to come and visit us. Marie used to serve on the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. She was in town to give a talk. So I invited her over. I said, why don't you, I'd like to meet you, like to talk to you, like to hear you, and I'd like you to meet with my colleagues. We have what's called the Monday afternoon group. It's led by my auxiliary bishop, Bishop Parker. It's him and 4 or 5 lay colleagues, and they spend 2 or 3 hours every Monday afternoon looking at this issue and looking at the Archdiocese's response to it and learning all the time. Sometimes it's reviewing files. Sometimes it's looking at what might have come in, whether it's an abuse case from a volunteer, or whether it's a boundary violation or a vulnerable adult. I said, you know, you work hard on this, but let's listen to what Marie has to say. I invited members of the Independent Review Board that's been in our diocese and many dioceses for many years, lay people who help us look over our shoulders, make sure we're trying to do the right thing. What Marie told us, she described how when she was in Ireland, she was 13 years old, she was abused by her parish priest, and she went for years, kept it in her mind and heart and soul, and it burned there. And then she got the courage to bring it to a parish priest and to the church in Ireland. The response was just terrible. She described that for us. We were riveted. What also riveted me was how after going through this crucible, she came out of it. She still suffers. It's still a part of her life, but she's dedicating her life, just like Juan Carlos, to helping the church learn from its past, to try to prevent this in the future, and to bring about some measure of healing. That's one form of listening. There's another form of listening, and it's a learning curve for me. Last year we had what I call the year of the Pennsylvania Grand Jury Report and the year of Theodore McCarrick. The Archdiocese of Baltimore has Pennsylvania on the top of it and the Archdiocese of Washington right below us. So I felt a little bit like a sandwich. It hit us pretty hard. Hit us hard. So I did 18 listening sessions. I sponsored 18 listening sessions all over the Archdiocese. They were long evenings. And they were not easy evenings, and they weren't meant to be, and they shouldn't have been. But I did hear two things loud and clear. Number one, that our people do indeed want bishops to be held accountable, whether it's for their own misbehavior or for dropping the ball in handling these cases and in being negligent, in preferring clericalism and institutional self-protection to reaching out appropriately to those who have been harmed by any one of us, whether it is a priest or a volunteer or a teacher in a school, whoever it might be. Loud and clear, you bishops have to find a way to be held accountable. Number two, more lay voices at the table. I mean, I could have been half asleep for these 18 sessions, and I wouldn't have missed that. So we go to the November bishops' meeting held in Baltimore, and there's proposals on the table for holding bishops accountable. I was all in favor of them. I felt that they were in some way responsive to what I had heard in those 18 listening sessions. And we get in there, and the bishop, to put it, the bishop's meeting, to put it mildly, gets derailed. And like a lot of us, we were pretty upset. We were angry about that. Pope wanted us to take some other steps first, and I think he wanted us to have our proposals become more mature. But I did go home, and I got with the auxiliary bishops and with that Monday group, and I asked the question, well, we couldn't do it on a national level. Is there something we can do locally? And I said, why don't we put in an independent third-party reporting system so that if myself or one of the auxiliary bishops in the Archdiocese of Baltimore engages in misbehavior or in misconduct of any kind, or is seemingly ignoring an allegation, it gets reported, and it doesn't come to my office or any office I'm responsible to, but to the two retired judges who sit on the independent review board, and their job is to report out to law enforcement if that's appropriate, and also to the papal nuncio. Later on, this past June, something similar, but perhaps even more thought out, was voted on by the U.S. bishops. We're in the process of implementing it. I hope and pray it will at least set a good direction. None of these things in and of themselves solve the problem. They only set a direction. Might just add that that it fell to me to sort of do the trial run on what's known as the metropolitan model. That is to say that when allegations are made against bishops, there has to be some mechanism for investigating them. The way the church is set up, you have archbishops, and their archdioceses include smaller dioceses in the surrounding area, and that constitutes a province. The archbishop is known as the metropolitan. So it would normally fall to the archbishop to, if there's an allegation against one of his suffragan bishops, to mount an investigation that would use the expertise of laypersons. So came an allegation with regard to one of my suffragans, the former bishop of West Virginia. And it fell to me, before there was a vos estis, to try to do an investigation. I did not do it perfectly. What I'm happy to report, however, is that the allegations were taken seriously. They were investigated by experts, lay experts, none of whom were in the employ of the church in any way. Report went to Rome in March, and for what is sort of lightning speed in the life of the church, we got an answer by mid-July. The bishop was censured. The first one censured for harassment of vulnerable adults and also financial questions. And a new bishop was put in place a short time later. It was not perfect. It was rough, bumpy, rocky. But it at least shows it can work. It could work. Final thing I would just like to say is, I love the church. We all love the church. We love the church's mission. We believe the church has come to us from the Lord. We're also made up of fallible human beings with a lot of weakness, a lot of blind spots, and sometimes we're tragically flawed people. We've got to address this. We've got to continue being held accountable, because the church's mission to spread the good news of Jesus Christ depends on it. I'm so glad you're here, and I'm so humbled to be a part of this conversation. Thank you.
All right, I have about 18 follow-up questions I would like to ask, but unfortunately, I am also the guy who is tasked with keeping an eye on the clock, and we are running low on time. We want to make sure we get the opportunity for some questions to be aired. So we have 3 people here in the audience tonight who are going to be putting questions to the panel. I would ask each of the 3 of you, if your question is directed to somebody specific, say that. Otherwise, I will play traffic cop and decide who's going to respond. So first up, we have Ann Tinbrunsel, who is the David E. Gallo Professor of Business Ethics in the Mendoza College of Business. Her research interests focus on the psychology of ethical decision-making. Dr. Tinbrunsel.
First of all, thank all of you for your insightful comments. I think the rest of the audience would agree. We've learned a lot, and I thank you for your efforts prior to this point as well. I think we can all agree as well that our very first step we needed to do was to identify and remove the bad apples for this particular abuse crisis. But I think many of us would agree, and many of the panelists said, that it goes beyond a few bad apples at one point in time, that there are historical cases of abuse in various forms, there's some prediction of future abuses in various forms, and that these are really due to these systematic flaws in the barrel itself, in the Catholic Church, the blind spots. As we look to move forward, rather than just sitting and waiting for it to be fixed by the bishops, by the Pope, what actions can members of the Catholic Church do to try and help begin to repair that barrel and move us forward, despite knowing that we'll always be infallible? Thank you.
Kathleen, would you like to take a stab at that?
Well, thank you for the question. I am asked that a lot. What can we as lay people do to help the church work through this? There are so many things that lay people are already doing, and I would encourage you to get involved, to be educated, to get your fellow Catholics and non-Catholics educated about the issues of abuse, not just of minors, that's critical, but also of vulnerable adults, to understand what the limits are on pastoral care. A priest, unless they're licensed, for example, is not necessarily your marriage counselor. It's not the person that's going to fix your relationship. You need to be educated. Your children need to be educated. You need to support the people who do work in Catholic ministries, whether they're ordained or they're not. They need friendship. They need adult friendship. They need companions. They shouldn't be living their lives totally isolated and not with people. You need to reach out to people who you know have been abused and offer them care and comfort, but mostly you need to listen to what they have to say. And I think Archbishop Lori said very well that it's one thing to be sitting there with someone, but it's another thing to really be hearing their pain. And for many people, just talking about their pain helps them just a little bit more to heal.
Briefly, does anyone, Archbishop?
And thank you, Kathleen, and thanks for the great question. I mentioned about involving laity, and it's not simply a matter of establishing councils and having meetings. The way I look at it is I need the help of qualified, committed laypersons who have expertise that I'll never have. And so it's not just a question of, the question is who's sitting around the decision table. It's not certainly a place at the Eucharistic table. There has got to be a place at the decision table. This does affect church governance and how we look at this. And I don't think that, and there's bishops and priests involved in this. There are lay professionals who are deep in the life of the church and very dedicated. But sometimes you need people who come in with totally different perspectives and expertise that we who work in the church every day don't have, and who upend us and who challenge us. I think when I talk about involvement of laity, that's kind of what I mean.
Juan Carlos.
Very fast. I agree with you. We cannot wait until the bishops go through their learning curve and learn how to listen. And all. We need not only lay people, I would say we need more women in the church that are trained, that are prepared. We need more women to break this men's club to bring all their talents and their training to heal, to help us heal. We need them. We can't have women in the sacristy. We have to have them front and center in the church. And we can't wait for bishops to finish their learning curve. Survivors need us now. And what is very important, it blows my mind and it makes me angry when I hear bishops, not only in the United States, but all over the world, in my country, in Chile, in Peru, I hear them say, well, you know, in 1980, 1990, in the 2000s, we didn't have protocols. So I didn't know how to act. Look, I want to tell them, you know what? Raping a child has been wrong before Christ, after Christ, Middle Ages, now, and it always will be wrong. So you better learn.
All right, next we have Eduardo Luna, who is a senior from Phoenix, Arizona, majoring in political science and economics. He is an intern for the Alliance for Catholic Education, and in my opinion, the most important item on this brief resume, a senior student manager at North Dining Hall. After this event, I want to see if you can hook me up with a free lunch while I'm on campus, all right? Eduardo, what do you have for us?
First, I'd like to follow up by also thanking each and every one of you for your insight. I'll go ahead and just keep my question relatively short. The church has been plagued by sexual abuse scandals in the past. What differentiates the church response today from previous responses?
All right, well, Peter, you talked about a change in the church response. Do you want to get us started on this?
I think I should start out by repeating what I said, that I think most of us, myself included, know less than we think we know or that we ought to know. The question of the abuse of children, and actually Dr. McChesney could say more about that, in various cultures all over the world, over the centuries, is terrible. To what extent that happened in the church, or whether there was, in fact, as a lot of evidence shows, unusual spike in abuse of young people by priests. I'm only speaking about the United States between the 1980s and between the 1960s and the late 1980s and 1990s. I don't know. I do think that's a question for investigation, to seek out the causes if that was the case. And if abuse has been, a factor, as some people would argue, in the medieval church and so on, I think we just have to recognize we live in a different world. That was wrong then. It's wrong now, but it's recognized as wrong now, at least in some places. And I think that changes the whole situation.
Anyone want to add anything to that before we move on? Excellent. Brevity is the soul of wit. Finally, we have Grace Murphy, who is a sophomore from Indianapolis, Indiana, majoring in science, pre-professional studies, and theology. Interesting combination. All right, Grace, floor is yours.
Well, thank you, panel, for coming today and for giving me the opportunity to speak. My generation did not cause this problem in the church, but we are certainly feeling the effects of it. Whether we like it or not, it has become our job in this crisis to support the survivors, justly punish the abusers, and turn an eye of scrutiny to the leaders. I did not sign up for this, but the choice was taken for me when the priest at my high school was accused. I know many of my peers have similarly felt the sting of betrayal by men they trusted, and some of them have left the church because of it. My question is, what would you say to this new generation of Catholics facing this huge responsibility, especially as many of us find ourselves questioning and even departing the church?
I'd like to
Please,
say
Peter.
something about that, because I think that's a very important question. I think something already has changed. One of the terrible things about the abuse, what I have learned from talking to scores of people, is the deferential attitude that reigned in their families that often made the victim survivors not abused, not believed by those closest to them, and caused tears in the family and between the victim survivors and the people that they most needed to go through the trauma and the consequences. It's something that seems, it's just disastrous. Well, your generation, I think, is different. I really do think there is not that deferential attitude toward authority, even church authority. There's a much more thoughtful, critical attitude, and I think already that will make a difference. First point. Second point is, I think the evidence shows that this really distressing loss to the church of young people and even older people is not first of all caused by the sex abuse crisis. It's caused by a sense of a lack of spiritual sustenance in terms of worship and preaching. It's caused by a failure to form in the church young people, so that even 13-year-olds now are talking about finding beliefs implausible. And it's caused by a failure of the church to offer persuasive answers to a number of important questions about sexuality. Those are the things that come up first when people are polled about that. Then the sex abuse crisis or scandal becomes, in my view, and this is my opinion, more of a confirming attitude than an initiating attitude of this kind of disaffiliation. It's not necessarily radical, but it's disengagement, disinterest, and drift away from the church. So somehow or other, those things have to be addressed as well, and the sex abuse crisis clearly is an obstacle to much work that the church has to do in a lot of other areas about worship, preaching, formation, theological answers to difficult moral questions.
And I want to say, great. And I want to say, Grace, that thank you as a survivor, because your generation is really leading all of us now, right? I feel that people in your generation that have been abused, unfortunately, will know that there's people out there that will immediately believe them, listen to them, and not wait for learning curves. And so I think it is important that you keep questioning, that you keep modernizing the church, that we break this clericalism. The church is all of us. All of us. Nobody's more important. There's hierarchies and people can do more or less things, but the church is ours. And nothing says that your generation, men and women, can ask questions, question certain practices, get involved. You know, what has sustained me through my own personal demons and I hate to play the victim, but what has helped me has been my faith and my friends and people that believed me when others were insulting me in the media everywhere and cardinals were insulting me. So what you can do, what you all can do for survivors is unimaginable, and it's great. And for that, I really thank you. So keep doing it.
Right, we only have about 10 minutes or so left, and I do want to get in a couple of questions from those who have been following this event online and bring them into the conversation. So we have two questions that are directed at specific panelists, which also has the advantage that only one person can pop off, which will help us with the economy of time. So the first is for Juan Carlos, and it's slightly provocative, okay, a little bit edgy, so strap in. The question is, do you think Pope Francis only changed his stance on Chile because of the widespread negative press he received, or do you think he had a genuine change of heart?
Mm-hmm. So without being, without trying to compromise I think it was both. I think the negative press, and for this, we always thank journalists and reporters because they bring, really, I mean, they deserve so much credit because when nobody wanted to hear us, there were journalists that would follow the story, and even though there was media fatigue, and the church is very powerful, and bishops are very powerful. So, and they can
Are
stop.
you feeling powerful right now?
Well, but I'm telling you, we've talked about statistics here, and we talk about, oh yes, it's gone down, no, in Chile it's gone up, in Peru it's gone up, in India it's gone up, in Philippines, it's just the tip of the iceberg. As much as we want it to stop, we've only seen the tip of the iceberg. So I believe that the bad press was, how can I say it, a shock for Pope Francis, realizing, because also he, I feel, was, in the Chilean case, was very informed and misinformed by the cardinals and by whole bishops' conference, 33 bishops, that literally it's like a band of criminals. They all have issues of cover-up, abuse themselves, and he's already fired 9, and he's going to keep firing some. But this is not just in Chile. It's in Peru. It's in other countries, and we're going to see more, as I said. So I do believe that Pope Francis had a wake-up call with the bad press, but also when he really saw what was happening in Chile and got the accounts from the people that were suffering themselves. So I think, and again, I have had the great opportunity to speak to him very frankly. I don't mince words with him. I'm obviously very respectful. He's the Pope, but I don't mince words with him, and I tell him, and I truly believe that he gets it. Now, that we all want things to go faster, absolutely. That survivors can't wait, absolutely. But I blame a lot of the bishops. And when I say all the bishops, and when I say the church, I don't want you to think that I'm generalizing and that everybody's bad. I just explained that I was educated by amazing priests of the Holy Cross, and that I spent amazing times here at Notre Dame and met the most wonderful priest that taught me to love myself, to love God, and to sustain my life through what has carried me through this terrible thing. But I'm telling you, I believe bishops go back to their diocese and do the same things over and over again. Why? Because they're attached to this clericalism, they're elitist, and they want to stay in power. And that we must break. And so to your question, when you said earlier, it's on us to keep questioning and to keep telling them that that is wrong.
And this is for Kathleen. Kathleen, we have been talking about the role of the church in dealing with the clerical sexual abuse scandals, but what about the role of the criminal justice system? And related to that, what is the church's responsibility to cooperate with civil authorities?
Well, thank you for the question, and to the viewer who sent that in. The role of law enforcement, and that is my background, I think is extremely important in these issues. The abuse of a child, and in many states the abuse of a vulnerable adult, is a criminal act. And the people who are most capable of investigating that, of finding out the facts, and bringing the individual responsible to justice are the law enforcement personnel. The cooperation among bishops, dioceses in the 60s, 70s, and 80s at the height of the incidents of abuse was negligible. You just didn't see cooperation between law enforcement and dioceses. Over those years, mandatory reporting laws were enacted in most every state in the United States, and people were trained, particularly in our Catholic schools, that there needed to be mandatory reports made. It goes beyond just picking up the phone and calling. You have to have cooperation on the parts of the principals, on the parts of the people at the Chancery. You have to maintain good records. And I will tell you that sometimes the records that we look at in dioceses and religious communities are wanting and are not as good as, you could find your baptismal record from 1868, but you can't necessarily find the report that somebody made of their abuse in 1962. Things didn't get written down. But it's part of the Charter for Protection of Children and Young People. It's audited too every single year, that when new cases come in, that they're reported to law enforcement. Every survivor, every person that reports a crime of abuse is told that the cases are going to be reported to law enforcement, or in the case of if it's a minor who's been abused at that point, to child protection agencies within the states. The relationships that I've seen develop since 2002 till now, 2019, it's a sea change in terms of the cooperation among the religious communities and dioceses and law enforcement. That's who should investigate crimes.
So we need to bring this plane in for a landing. I am going to exercise the moderator's prerogative to put the last question myself. And so I would like each of you briefly, no more than a minute, just briefly answer this question. When Father Jenkins began thinking about the purpose of this series, one of the things, as he described it to me, was to shift the conversation to some extent from rage to recovery. That is, not simply, although we can never stop listening to the anger of abuse victims because it's the motor fuel for reform, that if that's all we ever do, then we never get around to doing the heavy lifting of actually doing justice to those victims and ultimately helping the church to heal. So, what is one concrete, realistic, achievable thing that each of you believes the church ought to do right away that it has not yet done to make recovery and healing possible? Okay? Juan Carlos, why don't we begin with you?
Of course. I didn't have time to think.
You seem to be doing fine so far.
I think the church needs to be transparent. I think, Bishop, Archbishop, you have an opportunity to lead amongst your peers in putting lists out of predator priests, of not hiding, of being transparent, of collaborating with law enforcement, of putting, self-policing doesn't always work. So these committees of lay women, lay men in the church it needs to happen. So transparency, and also put the survivor first. I'm not speaking for me because I'm nobody, but
I just got in trouble for putting the survivor first, by the way.
Well, yeah, well, so funny, but hilarious.
Irony alert.
Yeah. And also understand when survivors are angry. Survivors have gone through horror. You cannot imagine what I was 14, 15 when I was abused for 8 years, and I think of myself as someone who is an executive at a multinational company, who is in charge of different countries and stuff, and I look back and I look at that kid and I say, how could I have been so dumb? How could I have been? And it's hard to forgive oneself, but through my faith, through friends, through family, through people like you, I can heal. And I feel it's my duty, now that I've discovered that, to do it for others. So I'll never shut up. And they might want me to shut up, but I'm not, as long as I can help one person. So giving opportunities in the church for survivors to help other survivors as well, that's really important. I mean, there's so much we could do, but that's what I think now.
All right, Peter?
I've been in any number of discussions since last January about this, and the headings are ones that we have touched upon: hearing and healing victims, role of women's leadership, and so on. There's a couple of common threads running through them that make me a little uneasy. One is the belief that this is totally in the hands of the church. And it seems to me, as someone who spent a lot of his life working in the secular world, among other things covering a whole range of religious groups, including the fact that virtually every one of them had a sex abuse scandal. It's made me very conscious of the fact that there's an outside world there that has, in many ways, different perspectives, different outlooks, different agendas, and we as Catholics must respond to that. And I have one specific suggestion, which is that there are certain things that bishops cannot do and lay people have to take up responsibility for. Specifically speaking about the future of the United States, I don't think bishops, because of their loss of credibility for past actions, often for predecessors who may have been long deceased by now, and because of their primary responsibility for unambiguously condemning sexual abuse and for healing and not re-traumatizing victims, there are certain things they can't do. And I think there have to be independent lay voices who are clearly independent of the bishops and exercise their own public judgments about saying what is good and what are shortcomings or even really unfortunate things about the whole series of investigations that we're going to face over the next 10 years or so. If you'll let me say one other thing, because I think that Juan Carlos has been very helpful in keeping in mind the worldview, and I do tend to have the American view. I think the church in the United States should be proud of the zero tolerance policy and of the fact that they put preventative programs in place and establish independent auditing of how well those programs were operating. Now, the whole world is not the United States, governments are different, et cetera, but I do think that we should press this, recognizing the different cultures and situations, nonetheless say to others that we think you ought to emulate those.
When I first started covering this in Rome, the sex abuse crisis was an American problem. Now America is often seen as the solution instead of the problem, which will tell you a great deal about the ground that we've covered in the intervening period of time. Okay, transparency, independent lay oversight. Kathleen?
Well, I agree with all that's been said thus far, and particularly want to re-emphasize what Juan Carlos said about transparency, about getting the lists of names out there so that people can see who the known abusers are, but not just here, but around the world. Because I know some of the people of whom you speak, and that has to be done. If there were a wish list, another thing on my wish list to be done would be to break the log jam of cases in Rome. There are hundreds, I don't know the exact number, but I know it's well into the hundreds of cases for laicization, for penal trials, sitting in Rome on people's desks that are covered with cases. And there's also sort of infighting among some of the dicasteries of, well, whose responsibility is it if it's someone who belongs to a society of apostolic life versus a bishop versus a priest versus a woman religious, whoever it is. There is no professionalization, in my humble opinion, of that particular process. If companies were run the way that the Vatican handles these cases, it would just be atrocious for world economy. So I would say we need to get that logjam, not just for the victims, but for justice of the accused as well.
Newsflash, Kathleen, there is a place where companies are run the way the Vatican is. It's called Italy.
John, can I, one minor thing that, Archbishop, you've done a lot, but one thing that Peter was saying, I mean, there's going to be cases, there's going to be, and the church, not only in the United States, but everywhere, but here in the United States especially, they say, oh, we're with the victims, we're with the survivors, but the first thing they do in some dioceses, some big cardinal, some big archbishop, they hire the best PR firms, and they hire, because they spend millions of dollars in PR. Why don't we accept what is inevitable, what is there? We're humble, and we just collaborate with the justice system.
So transparency, not spin. Archbishop, the last word to you.
A couple of observations. Number one, my archdiocese can't afford to do that, so we don't do it. Number two, I'm going to address learning. Learning is not an excuse for not acting. Learning means it's too big. We know it's wrong. We know it's heinous. We know it is an offense against God and human dignity and the law. But we also have to understand that we don't understand it in its fullness, particularly how to address it effectively and to create this healthy atmosphere in the church. We've come a long way. But what I'm getting at is we can never be complacent. Any bishop who tells you he's done it perfectly is telling you something that ain't true. And that's what I meant by the learning curve. Doesn't mean you're ignoring the victims while you're busy learning. It means that you are learning more and more how to do this more adequately. And it's a simple stance of humility. Church has to be humble about this. Number two, I think every diocese should have its list out. We've had ours out since 2002. We were the second in the country. If you look at Baltimore's list, it doesn't just give you names, it tells you where they were stationed. So if you were victimized by one of these priests, you can find out when and where. And we've been adding to the list. So when the Pennsylvania report came out, we looked to cross-check to see who served also in Baltimore, because we're next-door neighbors. So the list, it's not just getting the list out, it's having an adequate list that will be really useful to those who may have been victimized. Third thing you can do is strengthen your independent review board and meet often. And these are not committees that bishops run. The independent review board runs itself. When I go to it, I'm staff. They ask me questions. I don't run the meeting, nor should I. They should put out, as we do, their own report at the end of the year. They should report on the diocese, not have the diocese report. That's something you can do right now. And the final thing that's got to be put in place, and got to be put in place well, is the bishop's accountability measures. And there were several of them. The most important one is independent reporting. Third-party reporting that's out of the control of the bishop being reported about. And I think that there has to be consequences for us when we've dropped the ball or we have engaged in heinous behavior. At the end of the day, we don't have this expertise. Peter, you're absolutely right. The one thing we ought to be able to do is to form a partnership, create a healthy atmosphere, and work on conversion, encounter with Christ, walking with people, and having the church be the church that preaches the gospel, the church that draws us into the loving embrace of Christ and the church that goes out to the poor and the marginalized. That's what we should be leading. And we're not going to be able to do it without a warm partnership, but also a partnership in which we're all holding each other accountable until that day when we give an account of ourselves before the judgment seat of God. Thank you.
Well, you were all exceptionally generous souls. I asked you for one thing we could do. You each gave me about a half dozen. But I think if we sorted through all of that, and we will be doing that in the days and weeks to come, you would have the beginnings of a fairly ambitious and remarkable reform program. Ladies and gentlemen, the legendary Father Theodore Hesburgh once said that the role of a Catholic university is to be one of the places where the church does its thinking. I think you would agree with me tonight that with our four amazing guests, we have heard some truly remarkable and profound thinking going on here tonight. So please join me in thanking these four. This is not the end of our conversation, merely the beginning. There will be other events to come in this series. So please, folks, stay tuned. Thank you and good night.